Thank you very much. So on that note, maybe we just open it up for some questions from the audience. We literally have a packed, overflowing room. I can see people all around me. So try and just draw my attention. I know some of you at the back might find it difficult to do that, but you can poke me. And yes, I entirely realize. So, and we'll try and do it. Just a small request. The event is being live streamed, so I'll request you to kindly keep your comments or questions brief so that we can give as much of a chance to everyone. And precisely the technological forces that you alluded to are hopefully taking this event to a much wider audience even as we speak. So, yeah, Kunal.
Yeah. I'm Kunal from Mint. So, a couple of quick questions. You said in the neighboring countries we should not be seen as an ally to one faction, one group, one political leader. But whether we like it or not, we have come to be seen as like that. In Nepal, for example, now we are supporting Sher Bahadur and Prachanda, and we don't see eye to eye with KP Oli. We have worked with him in the past, but not now. We may work with him in the future. Some of similar things happening in Bangladesh. For a longer, we have supported Hasina. In Sri Lanka, we supported Sirisena versus Rajapakse. Something is now happening in Maldives as well as we speak. So, do you think this is a viable strategy, or is it just a short-term crisis-to-crisis strategy that India has evolved for neighborhood? Just the second question about the North Korean nuclear weapons, and especially the ICBM capability, that has sort of decoupled the American alliance with the South Korea and Japan. Do you see it as ending with nuclear weapons with both Japan and South Korea? Whether or not that happens, how do you see this ICBM capability transforming A, the Asian security architecture, and 2, non-proliferation regime?
Sure, please.
Yeah. So there is a difference in having to deal with day-to-day relations between countries and having a longer-term frame within which you try to pursue those relations. So there may be no alternative but to work with whichever is the government in power in trying to deal with issues that crop up in the bilateral relationship. But I do believe that your objective should be to utilize whatever opportunities you have to precisely do what I said you should do, which is to develop strong interdependencies. So let me give you what they say a teacher by negative example. You look at the relationship between, say, China and Myanmar. Now, one could say that China utilized a certain opportunity that presented itself in the 90s, where Myanmar was isolated, or at least the military government in Myanmar was isolated, to actually put in place as many strong linkages with that country as possible, whether it was in terms of border trade, investment, in supporting the military. Over a period of time, therefore, that window of opportunity was used to put those in. When the political situation in Myanmar changed, and you had Aung San Suu Kyi come in, you had the National League of Democracy come in. Initially, perhaps there may have even been expectations that, Myanmar is going to veer away from China, and there were some shifts which took place. But if you take the record of the last few years, China has re-emerged as a very critical partner for Myanmar. Whether in terms of dealing with, say, the ethnic groups on the periphery of Myanmar, or in terms of infrastructure development, energy partnership. Why has this happened? Even if there are oscillations on the political side, you have, as I said, a network of interdependencies which limit how much that oscillation can take place. So what do you need to do with your neighborhood? Of course, you will have to deal with Mr. Oli if he's there. Of course, you have to maybe deal with somebody who's very anti-India, and you need to be able to confront that. But longer term, it all should all be within a longer term framework. It should not be an ad hoc sort of a neighborhood policy. So if over a period of time, I say that, okay, in the next 10 years, I'm going to put these linkages in place, leverage in place, connectivity, for example, or the kind of relationship that you have today with Bhutan, because thanks to the hydropower cooperation. You know, even if there are political issues, there is a limit beyond which they cannot go because of those interdependencies. That is the kind of neighborhood policy or strategy that I've been trying to talk about.
On North Korea and the
Yeah. So, whatever may be now the discourse, the fact is that, in a sense, North Korea is now a nuclear weapon state. It has developed a delivery capability, and a delivery capability whose range is increasing with every test. It is unlikely that even with those sanctions, that there will be a reversal of this. You know? So, a nuclear weapon armed North Korea is probably here to stay. So, the challenge then now becomes deterrence. I would not say that there has been a decoupling of the US from, say, South Korea and Japan, but certainly questions will be asked that you said that you will not allow this line to be crossed, but that line has been crossed. How do you propose to deal with it? You know? So in that respect, I think there could be, it is not yet the case, but there could be some doubts expressed about the strength of the American alliance. If Japan feels that its security is under grave threat, and the alliance does not give it the means to deal or deter such a threat, the pressure to also become a nuclear weapon state will certainly be there. I have no doubt about that. And to that extent, I don't think China has been very clever. That it has tried to sort of position itself as the only country which can actually help deal with the Korean crisis, and yet has not really done what it could have in preventing the emergence of a nuclear weapon armed North Korea. The problem with this kind of, playing this game is that when it crosses a certain threshold, then the game changes. So if tomorrow Japan becomes a nuclear weapon state, it will dramatically change the regional security situation, no doubt about it. Because here you are talking about not a small country with nuclear weapons, here you are talking about the third largest economy in the world, a technological power in the world. If that power becomes a nuclear weapon state, it will be a dramatic change in the security situation in Asia.
I must add that there is actually quite a lot on the nuclear stuff, especially on the Indo-US nuclear deal in the book, which I'm sure scholars will continue to mine for a long time to come. Lavanya, you want to say?
Thank you, Bas. Thank you for that fascinating conversation.
Madam, please use the mic.
Yes. Could you just...
Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you for that fascinating conversation. If I could take you back to your reflections on the climate change process, I completely agree with you that the devil is in the details, and it's the current negotiations that really matter for India, and India's interest could be severely compromised if it doesn't actually negotiate very effectively right now. But taking a cue from Srinath's last question, do you think India is in a position to negotiate effectively in these interim sort of negotiations? I say this because, as you know, India tends to invest all its negotiating capital in the big bang moments. In Copenhagen and Paris, everything comes together just in time for that. And all the submissions that need to be made in the meantime, all the sort of little details that matter, India is not very well equipped to do that. And in fact, I should say that most of the current negotiating team wasn't even in Paris. So there's a big turnover in officials as well. So do you think India is actually equipped to deal with those kind of day-to-day negotiating issues which actually determine our strategic future in this negotiation? Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya, and thank you for being someone who has always been very supportive of, India's negotiating strategy. Um, with respect to capacity, um, I didn't know anything about climate change when I was made chief negotiator on climate change. So all of us do go through a very sharp learning curve. Perhaps some learn more quickly than others, but I would not say that the capacity is not there. I think the capacity is there. It is inevitable that it's the big moments which come in the public domain. What is happening in the small seminar rooms where the horse trading is taking place, that does not make news. You spoke about making the submissions and coming up with position papers. Uh, if you take the multilateral negotiations from 2007 to 2009, the impression was that this is the India which only can say no and has nothing to offer as an alternative. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, we in fact, if you go back, you will see the number of submissions which were made by India on virtually every issue under negotiation, both nationally but also as part and parcel of basic. So there, the impression that somehow we are not quite there can sometimes be a misleading impression. Now, I do not know what is the situation today. Are we still doing the same thing, getting the right kind of people together and making those submissions which are required? I certainly hope so. But I would not say that India is not able to really deploy the kind of intellectual ability, negotiating skills which are really required to get you a good deal. My experience, not only with the climate change negotiations, but also my experience with, say, international, trade negotiations, and even other negotiations like the nuclear deal. Um, I can say with confidence that despite not having the same battery of lawyers and political diplomats on the other side, we actually did not do too badly. So I would not underestimate our ability to actually get a good deal for India when the pressure is on you.
And I must say that in the chapter on the negotiations of the nuclear deal, you also bring out what are the kind of internal dynamics which are there, which in some ways made it quite difficult even for us to evolve a common position.
Well, one of the things is that there is more diplomacy expended at home than abroad.
So I think that comes out quite strongly in pretty much every such part of the book. So Robert? Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. Two questions. One on the Korean crisis and India's role in the last several months. Just your thoughts on, because the present policy has been more or less to bandwagon with the United States on this sanctioned punitive approach. Perhaps would an alternative approach where you could have helped in this process of bridging the divide between these sort of two hostile positions, could that have been something where we could have undertaken? And secondly, India has had this position of external powers and how they involve themselves in the subcontinent, and which is a position that has a lot of continuity but also change over the last several decades. In the last 10-15 years, I see interesting contrast between how Indian policymakers view the US role in the subcontinent and now China's role in the subcontinent. Do you see a larger framework, or are we making sort of adjustments for these different actors? And what type of role would India like to see external powers play in the subcontinent? Because I sometimes see we haven't been as effective in conveying or signaling some sort of a relationship. Because let's face it, I don't think external powers are going to leave this region completely alone. So what is the type of relationship that India is comfortable with or should be shaping towards, rather than a blanket veto, which is simply not possible in this world? Thank you.
Well, as you said, even if we want to veto, it's simply not possible. So, number one, it should come as no surprise that the manner in which we perceive activities in our neighborhood is not quite the same as we perceive the further we go away from the subcontinent. It may seem like a double standard, but that's the way it is. I mean, most countries are able to take somewhat more balanced positions the further away that issue is from them. Not quite when it comes to nuts and bolts with respect to their own region. So I'm not surprised that we have that kind of a dichotomy. And that dichotomy is likely to continue. Secondly, with respect to how we deal with that challenge of external involvement, you cannot, as you yourself acknowledge, say, this is my backyard and please keep out. That's no longer possible, if it ever was possible. But what you can do is to see whether or not, in terms of your relationship with your neighbors, you can actually offer the best in terms of what their interests may be, so that you are the preferred partner. Not that the United States of America is absent or China is absent, but in terms of the balance that those countries wish to maintain, you have so much to offer that what may be coming as advantage or benefit from any other source is perhaps somewhat less. So your interests are safeguarded more than would otherwise be the case. The other aspect is, which I think also, if you read the chapter on Nepal, becomes quite obvious, is that I can't keep them out, but can I make certain that they keep aligned with our interests and the way we deal with the issue. So, the United States of America, for example, during the period that we were dealing with Nepal, when we made the switch of saying, faced with the kind of, very authoritarian monarchy that was being put in place, it may be better to see whether or not, on the basis of the multi-party democracy principle, whether the Maoists and the seven-party alliance could come together. The United States of America did not like that. They felt that this was not the right way to go. And yet, because of the manner in which we had developed a kind of a consultative relationship with the United States, with UK, with the European Union, even with China, when we decided to go in a certain direction, none of these countries actually created any problems for you. So I have referred to, for example, our suspending the arms supplies to the Royal Nepal Army after the February sort of coup in Kathmandu. Even though there was considerable pressure on the US, on Israel, even on China to actually, break that suspension by arms supplies from them, they did not. They held the line. So that shows you how perhaps in a new situation you can adjust your diplomacy to achieve more or less the same thing, that the primacy of your interests in the neighborhood is also acknowledged by other partners. I think that is what we were trying to do.
We have a question from the gentleman there. Can I request you to come and speak into the mic, please?
Thank you for the insight, sir. I have a question. We have chose to opt out of OBOR, citing our sovereignty issues. What could be long-term implication in the geo-economic space? And the second question is India's efforts of IORA or Project Mawsum or the recent Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. How do you get the impressions from that? Thank you,
sir. A lot has been, talked about the OBOR, and is India missing the bus, as it were, by not signing on to it. Number one, I mean, there are two separate issues. One is CPEC, that is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And there, I think the position taken by India, at least as far as I'm concerned, is actually a justifiable position. Because it does go through territory which we claim as our own. for China to say that you should not raise this issue because there are economic benefits to be had from this corridor, I think is a bit self-serving and really smacks of double standards, because when China's territory is involved, or what it claims as its territory, it takes a very, very, in fact, obdurate stand about nobody else coming and doing any economic activity. In Arunachal, they even object to India, the central government in India, undertaking any activity in. So to say that, CPEC is, has no implication as far as your, territorial integrity is concerned is simply not acceptable. But that's with regard to CPEC. With respect to the OBOR, I have pointed out in some other presentations that I have made that OBOR is different, for example, from, say, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, where we are a participant. It is different from, say, the BRICS Development Bank, where we are a major shareholder. It is even different from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which we have become a member now. What is the difference? Difference is that all these other initiatives that I'm talking about are all multilateral in character. In the shaping of these institutions, the governance structures of these institutions, even the personnel of these institutions, we have had a very important role to play. We are the second largest shareholder in both these institutions. In one of them, the president is Indian. In the other, I think the vice president is an Indian, right? So these are multilateral institutions in which we have had a very major role in determining the architecture of these institutions. So they have been the result of very close consultative process. OBOR is not in the same category. Here is a design which has been put forward by President Xi Jinping. It is actually a string of, with very few exceptions, it is just basically a string of bilateral deals between China and a partner country. It's not a multinational thing. Even with respect to CPEC, I remember in one of the track 2 meetings I asked, okay, so if you have CPEC, would you persuade Pakistan, for example, to have links with India and give us transit? They said, no, that's not our business. So, it's basically, as I said, a sort of putting together of these bilateral deals. Now, if we have taken a position that unless we know what we are signing on to and how this is going to be, in a sense, put in place, there is good reason for us to have some degree of caution. Does not exclude the possibility that if tomorrow there are projects, say in third countries, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, where India and China can work together to develop, say, a port facility in Indonesia or some other, facility in some other country, there is no reason why there should be a problem, as long as it is economically feasible and it is of mutual benefit. So, not signing on to OBOR doesn't mean, therefore, that we have missed the bus. Because if it is worth the while of, say, a Alibaba or Xiaomi or Huawei to come and invest in India, to work together with India, because this is the fastest growing market for their products, they will come. If they don't come, it's their problem. Yeah.
On the positive sort of initiatives that he was talking about, what are the kinds of things that we have attempted to do, and whether you see any of that as sort of, because you do have something in the book about those things.
Yeah, so, I don't want to, and I don't like, a Mosam being put forward, or a spice route being put forward as a kind of a rhetorical response to what China is doing. That's simply not serious. If you need to be able to do something serious about this, then you have to actually invest time and energy in that. So in that context, I think that the Asia-Africa growth corridor, which I believe may be announced when Abe meets Prime Minister Modi is perhaps the most promising, because it brings together Japanese technology and capital along with the assets that India has. What are the assets India has? Capacity building is a very big thing that India is involved in African countries, and something for which it is very much sort of welcomed in Africa. The fact that with respect to project costs, even if the design is Japanese, even if the capital is Japanese, perhaps we can deliver at a much cheaper cost. Now, there is also, unlike the Japanese, we have strong diaspora communities in most of the important African countries. Can they be also an asset in terms of doing some of these projects? So I would say that potentially this is perhaps one of the more serious initiatives which have taken forward, and I would certainly hope that we can sort of put this in place. With regard to projects that we do, and this is something which I have drawn attention to again and again, is the fact that the major shortcomings that we have are in terms of our delivery capability. That China scores and our credibility then gets eroded because of our inability to deliver projects in time, because of bureaucratic delays, because of financial issues. You need to find a way out of this. This is not merely a foreign policy problem. This is also a domestic problem in terms of our ability to do projects within India itself. So in a real sense, it's a governance issue. So you need to be able to deal with that. Unless you fix that delivery capability, I'm afraid results will be suboptimal.
The gentleman there. So.
Sir, my name is Sudhir Kumar. I'm a retired IAS officer and a retired member of Central Administrative Tribunal. I'm sorry I've not had the benefit of reading your book, but then the title really interests me, because I personally think that you could have perhaps titled it "How World Sees India" rather than "India Sees the World," because of two reasons. Firstly, that around the time we became independent, Japan was considered to be a renegade nation in which everything was reverse engineering. They would open up everything, see, and then manufacture, and now they are the third largest power. In last 25 years, we have seen China overtake us so much that in about 25-30 years, we can't reach where China is today, and about 50 years, we can't reach where Japan is today. Our achievements have been, we have been good in space research, we have been good in atomic research, and we have been good in diplomacy in keeping India relevant and alive in the international fora. Apart from this, because of the non-productivity of our universities and technical institutions and the huge resource of manpower, we are nowhere. We are surrounded by China in Nepal, where they are having a railway line. They are in they're not yet luckily in Bangladesh, but Myanmar is there. Maldives and Malay, both are, actually with China, Hambantota is there in Sri Lanka. Pakistan is certainly not our friend. We are surrounded by China from everywhere. We are irrelevant. We are totally irrelevant, actually, diplomatically. So now, how do you see how world sees India?
Well, that probably gives me an idea for the next book. But I did feel that perhaps we are not fully conversant with how India sees the world. So a lot of the book, actually, while talking about how India sees the world, also covers a great deal of how the world looks at India as well. I think you are being rather harsh in terms of your assessment of what India has been able to achieve or not able to achieve. Of course, our record has success stories. Our record also has the stories of failures. But let me put to you that I think in terms of being able to sustain what is a remarkably open society, democratic society, ability to handle what is also a very diverse country and yet deliver the kind of economic and social development that we have been able to deliver is actually quite remarkable, to my mind. So I don't think we should belittle what we have been able to achieve. Um, with regard to the quality of human resources, it is something that we need to, of course, give a lot of attention to. But we have produced what is regarded internationally as a very successful, for example, you mentioned the space program or what we have been able to achieve with the nuclear program or what we have been able to do as an IT part. So it is not that there are no areas of excellence. I think the challenge is how do we sort of make these islands of excellence into a continent of excellence. You know, that needs a different approach. You have great pressure to be inclusive. You have great pressure to make certain that benefits flow to a larger and larger number of people. And this is a very large country with a very large population. And yet, the pressure is therefore sometimes that you reduce standards in order to be more inclusive, where, of course, admittedly much more difficult, you need to raise standards everywhere in order to be more inclusive. That's a somewhat different way of looking at your challenges. That is, I don't deal with the challenge by reducing standards all around, but I try to deal with those challenges by raising standards all around. Much more difficult, I agree, but that is what is required. While certainly there may be a sense that we are somewhat placed in a difficult situation because of the rise of China or because of the activities of, say, China in our neighborhood. If I compare with the kind of challenges which India faced, say, in the 50s or the 60s, I think we have remarkably more instruments available to us to deal with these challenges than we ever had before. For example, not because I was associated with it, but I do think that there could not have been an India-US nuclear deal or a waiver which we got from 45 countries in the NSG if India's standing was not, in fact, a country which had tremendous importance in the international scheme of things. So I don't think that the picture is one of only doom and gloom. We have to deal with those negative issues, and I have talked a great deal about how we need to deal with it. First of all, acknowledging that we are in a difficult place. Only then can you try and deal with it. But I think I would, on balance, still remain optimistic about the prospects of this country.
There are a few more questions around the table, so maybe we can collect a couple and sure. So first, let's begin with you.
Thank you very much. I was really not going to ask or make any comment, but it's so tempting. First of all, let me compliment you. I have also not read the book, but it's very tempting to go through it. So my compliments. And it goes to show that India still respects brain power. That's why the house is absolutely more than overfull. While listening to you and others, the thoughts were coming to my mind. Politicians also can think at times. That's a different story.
More than we could.
But I was thinking when I saw this Kautilya and Mahabharata, actually nothing has changed in the world. The world and humanity still respects or are scared of muscle and knowledge. India had both. When you talk about Guru Dronacharya had the brain power and Duryodhan had the muscle power. All these things really come out of defense. if America is what America is today, is because of their muscle power in terms of defense capabilities and the brain power of the universities. Because they have respected talent. I'm sorry, I'm just building up a little. And no society, no country can be looked up to if they don't respect their own talent.
That was my point also.
So maybe we are on the same page. But I certainly am quite optimistic about India. You mentioned the advantage of India in terms of capacity building. You use a word which slips out of my mind. But I think the greatest advantage of India is the talent and the knowledge. And I've always believed, because I also go around the world on various assignments, and the new world is designed by America, and that America is designing because of the strength of the Indian talents. If you go to any university, the best of the best are the Indian students and the Chinese also. The best instructors, the best doctors are Indians, right? The reason they are there because we don't respect our talent. If some innovation has to be taken place, it is indirectly connected with defense, right? But here, if somebody wants to really have a cutting-edge innovation, he will run around to my friends there who were earlier there, or to some politician, वो अपना जूता रगड़ देगा, मगर कोई unless a big businessman comes and says कि yeah, इसको देखो. Today, in my political environment, the biggest talent is sycophancy. Biggest talent. And you don't really have to have talent to survive. And the people who have talent will not get into sycophancy because the world is open to them. So you mentioned Israel, North Korea. Why are we talking about them? Because they have strong muscles. They have strong defense and offense capabilities, right? India has missed the bus because we have not respected the talent. Now, do you see, I don't want to get into politics of present or past or the future, but these are all aberration in the history. So I'm not much concerned about it. But do you see Nalandas and Takshilas of the world, because India was respected because of that. And we still can build both. So that we don't have to say, oh, America will say this or Israel will say that. China is China because they respect talent and they have muscle and they have economy also. So this is my just an observation. I do not know if you have any comment on these things and whether India will really at the helm of affair respect talent, and the talent doesn't have to be a big businessman.
So on the knowledge capital, shall we just collect a couple of more questions?
Yeah,
Because we're also
that's
running
fine.
out of time. So ma'am,
Supplementary
can we
to that?
come to you for a short question and then yourself?
Ambassador, I used to teach international affairs when I started teaching in Punjabi University, Patiala, and being a student of history to which you have given a lot of emphasis and respect and its place, do you feel that diplomacy, international affairs, the foreign policy, it needs to be very carefully tread upon? The preparation that we make for it, it needs to be very sound. And ad hocism that you were talking about would never lead to a policy that would be meaningful and fulfilling. Now, looking at the discussions that go on the television, in the print media, one does find that there is overreaching, over-promising. Will it lead to results which we need to receive now? That's my question. Thank you.
I'm Reena Marwa, ICSSR Senior Fellow. Just two short questions. One, towards the East. The countries in the East, especially ASEAN, are looking increasingly to India as a balancer to China. So, India has, of course, given some aid to the Philippines. India is going ahead with the trilateral highway reaching out to Indonesia as far as our Asia-Africa economic corridor is concerned. So, how much is India really doing, and if it really wants to come on as a balancer? Towards the left, and it's more of a Chinese problem which I'm talking about here, China has always been averse to any kind of chaos, any kind of disorder within their boundaries, and we know the Xinjiang problem. Do you think that CPEC of $46 billion and a little more than that is really more about strategic opportunity rather than an economic opportunity for China? So it really seeks to kind of limit India through Pakistan rather than being an economic opportunity for it. Yeah, what's your opinion?
Yeah, quick round of responses. Maybe we can do one more because I see many hands going up. We can hear as many people as we can.
The observations that you made, we can certainly do more, but I still do not think that it is, as I said, all doom and gloom. The reason why I say that is to just give you a personal example. When I started doing work on climate change, which, as I mentioned to you, was something new that I was doing, as part of the work that I was doing, I was also involved in the drawing up of what became the National Action Plan on Climate Change, where we have a number of national missions. For example, solar mission, which has become actually quite successful. We had national missions on water conservation or forestry. But more than that, the exposure that one had to amazing kind of innovative work being done in virtually every corner of this country by very ordinary people, scientists, professors, even activists, trying to find solutions to very major problems that this country faces. To give you an example, in a place like Andhra, where there were farmer suicides taking place, it is actually a group of agricultural scientists, some young bureaucrats, some NGOs who actually got together, worked through women self-help groups to actually wean away farmers from their monocrop sort of culture that had been propagated under the old intensive agriculture development program, where you were really looking at intensive agriculture in terms of larger and larger doses of chemical fertilizers, of pesticides, of hybrid seeds, using a lot of more water, which gave you good results initially, but then it became more and more diminishing returns, and the collateral damage in terms of loss of soil fertility or health consequences of using these toxic chemicals, and the old sort of farmers' economy, which was more multi-cropping, having animal husbandry, having horticulture, all that had been actually put aside. Now, through those efforts, actually, in large parts of Andhra today, and now this is being also copied elsewhere, you have actually been able to move from that kind of a strategy of development to one which is very water frugal, which does not use chemical fertilizers, uses only natural organic material, which does not use, in fact, chemical pesticides, but uses, by different kinds of cropping, by using certain biological material itself, you are able to deal with that, and yields, instead of falling, actually yields have gone up. Now, this I see as an example of what in this country is actually an explosion of innovation which is taking place all over the country. May not always be very apparent to us, but the talent that you are talking about is actually very widespread. So ultimately, I do have a sense of optimism because of the exposure that I have had at the ground level in many places to the kind of changes that are taking place, which may not be in a Harvard University laboratory, but which is actually nevertheless very, very relevant and important to the lives of the people of this country. The challenge always has been that what is happening in limited sort of areas, whether it is in agriculture or industry, how do we sort of scale it up? Exactly. That is a management problem. That's not an inherent, shortcoming of this country. It is something which is fixable. Now, fixing it also requires effort from people like you.
Correct that. I said I am very optimistic. I never said.
No,
that
I'm just.
no, I just will finish.
Yeah.
I'm just very optimistic, but we are very capable people. If our potential is this, we have not reached this. And we are not on the head table when we talk about big countries, like, defense. So what I meant is, how do we get into a big muscle with our brains?
So, you mentioned Chanakya. Even if you study Chanakya, many people think of him as the sort of apostle of realpolitik, of the importance of force in terms of interstate relations. But that's only part of the story. In fact, if you read Chanakya carefully, you see the importance that he attaches not only to economic capability or defense capability, but he also attaches a great deal of importance to what he calls mantra shakti, which is good counsel, good governance, which in modern terms it would be. Secondly, the importance that he attaches to making certain that war is a last resort, that you should be able to exhaust all other possibilities of getting what you want without having to actually use force. So, war, because of the very negative consequences it can have, he says that that should be really the last resort. So, I think we need also to look at our own statecraft traditions, perhaps not in such simplistic terms that it is only through power, the exercise of power, that you can actually get your objectives. There are other components of the exercise of power which also should be taken into account.
And you actually make good use of Niti Sara and other texts as well to talk about the same thing.
Yes, because
so I think actually there's a lot in the books
Yeah.
About this thing. So can we take two final questions?
I think that,
yeah, sure. If you want to respond.
So, just with respect to obviously diplomacy must be based on very careful consideration. The challenge that we today face is diplomacy in the digital age, where you are forced to react almost instantly to what may be happening. So the great advantage of diplomacy, which is being able to reflect, being able to deliberate before you actually react, that space has shrunk, and that is a very big challenge. You have leaders tweeting today. In some ways, it is very good that that kind of direct communication is taking place. But at the same time, if you do not have a leader who is schooled in statecraft, that kind of instant reaction can perhaps be very damaging. So, I would still say that you need to be able to retain the space for that deliberation in order to do a better job of diplomacy. How you are going to do it, I'm not very clear, but it is certainly, I believe that that's a very important part of diplomacy. With respect to Southeast Asia, this is only one part of the bigger problem which we face, that the expectations of India are much more than we are able to. Not that we have not done enough. I mean, if you look at, for example, with Southeast Asia, starting from Narasimha Rao's announcement of look east policy to where we are today, there has actually been a very substantive change. whether it is in terms of our economic relationship, investment relationship, defense relationship, in all those areas, we have actually done a great deal. Yet we fall short of expectations. So, in a sense, it is a good driver that we need to do more, but we should not, sort of neglect to also acknowledge that actually quite a great deal has been.
So can you just take two final questions? The gentleman there and then Yamini. I'm sorry, because this is a live telecast, we have to adhere to some.
First of all, sir, I'd like to thank you both for such an enlightening panel. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you talked about India's, how in a period of flux, India needs to carve out its own zone and how it needs to add to the leadership in the region. So, putting focus on the Rohingya crisis, do you think India not acting in a proactive manner has, to a certain extent, made it miss an opportunity of leadership in the region in South Asia, Southeast Asia? The other question is related to the Asia-Pacific Security Order and something what the lady there talked about, which was how would you rate the performance, or how would you envision the role of the ASEAN security community in mitigating conflicts in the region?
I just wanted to quickly tie together a theme that I think has emerged from this conversation, linked to where you end your book as well. The sort of question of capacity, governance, delivery, harnessing talent, which has emerged, with this question of a shifting global order and India needing to perhaps opening up to the potential of taking a new leadership role in this changing global order. But you haven't said anything more concretely about the governance of our foreign service that is going to be charged with this thinking through. There have been some conversations about the need for reform in the foreign service itself, but I was just curious, given that that's where we all want to be, do we really have, is the instrument at hand that's going to move us in that direction the right instrument? Does it need to be reformed, and is there a new type of governance architecture that we need to be thinking about there?
Okay. Yeah. With respect to the Rohingya issue, I certainly believe that any policy which demands that they should be, deported, is not in keeping with India's own traditions and the way we look at India. Could we do something about it? Difficult questions to answer. In Myanmar itself, the reason why this has become a very difficult issue for, say, somebody like Aung San Suu Kyi, who I believe is, I think by temperament, is someone who really upholds human rights, because she herself was, in a sense, a victim. The problem is that the Rohingya issue has become a very emotive issue, not just because of the pressure from the military, very importantly because also the hostility of the clergy, which is very influential in Myanmar, and thirdly because if you travel around the Burman areas, that is the heartland of Myanmar, you will find that there is a very strong negative sentiment amongst ordinary people as well. So she has a very difficult sort of challenge in front of her. How do you try to deal with this in as humane a manner as possible, without, in fact, inviting the very fierce opposition of not only two of the very most influential constituencies in Myanmar, that is the military as well as the clergy, but also because within the people themselves, there is this very strong sentiment. So it's not an easy task, and I think there needs to be also a degree of sympathy for the kind of situation that we face. Don't forget that in Europe you have seen the reaction to the refugee coming in. Is that humane or is that not humane? So is there some way in which we can help? The way you cannot help is by taking public positions. Because if you, as soon as you take public positions, the room for you to do something about it. All that you can do is perhaps do, if you have a good relationship with the country, how do you use channels of communication in order to try and bring about a change in birth. Are we doing that? I would certainly hope so. That this is something that India is doing, should be doing, because this is not only an India problem; it is a much larger problem, as you see, for Bangladesh and also for other countries in the region. So we have to recognize that with the complexity of the issue that we are facing. Now, with regard to the role of ASEAN, we have been saying with perhaps less confidence than before that we accept the centrality of ASEAN as far as regional security is concerned. Why do we say that? Because we believe that a united ASEAN, even if it is not very powerful, it provides a kind of a mediating platform in the region. If all the major powers in the region recognize that centrality of ASEAN, see their own interests in a more coherent ASEAN, in an ASEAN which is able to actually function as a vibrant economic community, but also as a community which is moving towards greater political coherence. Do we see that as in our interest? Until 2010, 2011, in fact, all the major powers saw that in their interests. Then in 2010, it started changing, because then China started using division within the ASEAN in order to promote its own interests, or what it thought its own interests, mainly with respect to the South China Sea, as you are aware of. So the role which ASEAN was playing and could have continued to play as I said, a very important mediating platform, a platform where there could be some managing of, if not reconciliation of very differing interests of the major powers in the region. That role has diminished, and I think unfortunately so. So that's is there some way in which we can revive that or help revive that? Remains to be seen. I'm not very sure whether. Ultimately, the main action has to be by the ASEAN countries themselves.
Could I just follow it up by saying that? Okay, fine.
You can carry on the conversation.
Yeah. So, with regard to the Foreign Service, I hope you won't mind my being parochial in this respect. And I don't say this because I'm from the service. I would really like to emphasize that against very heavy odds, with very small numbers that we have, if you look at the performance of the Indian Foreign Service over the last several years, it is actually quite remarkable. And this is the judgment not just of ourselves, patting ourselves on the back, but if you look at the kind of assessment that other foreign services make of the Indian Foreign Service, the quality of the service, its ability to actually deliver with very, very sparse resources, both in terms of the human resources as well as the material resources that are available, frankly, it is quite remarkable. Now, all that it shows is that if you were able to empower this service with the right kind of instruments, with the right kind of resources, actually you could do a better job. So, take for the climate change issue. Now, if you have a small service, how do you specialize?
Yeah, exactly.
As a foreign service officer, I had to do nuclear issues, I had to do later on climate change issues, I had to deal with cyber security issues. I mean, a whole lot of issues which are very specialized in nature and for which you need some degree of specialization. We do not have that opportunity. And yet, despite that, we have not done too badly. Even with climate change, I know you don't think we have done very well, but I think, I think even on climate change, we were, at least till Copenhagen, we were able to hold our own. So we need more numbers. And one good change was that, we were able to convince government to at least double the numbers. So from 750, we are now in 10 years' time going to be 1500, but even 1500 is too small. With the range of activities that you have to deal with the tremendous phenomenal expansion of your own engagement with the rest of the world, you certainly cannot do with such a small service. So I hope as a result of this discussion, maybe we will get more numbers. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think it's fair to say that, partly because, you belong to that very small pioneering service which had to do a lot more. We have a book like this which actually cuts across the gamuts of issues, and every single thing that we've talked about today, and there is more in the book, Ambassador Saran has personal experience of, including Myanmar where he was ambassador. So, he knows whereof he talks, and I think it just remains for me to say thank you, sir, for not just doing this event, but actually writing the book. Because I think many of us have been privileged to have conversations with you, and the book is the way of taking these conversations to much wider audiences. And I see that many people here already have picked up their copies. I'm sure they'd want to sort of chat with you afterwards and maybe get it signed. So please do join me in thanking Ambassador Saran, and thank you all for being here today.